Coming Together, Coming Apart. Episode 8, The Best of Enemies. I want to start this week with an apology. At the end of episode 7, I told you that for this week and next week, we would be leaving the peninsula to discuss the Cold War, the United Nations, and the Chinese Civil War. I did not know it at the time, but that was a lie. After thinking through our timeline and how these episodes fit together, I realized it made much more sense to talk about the first year of independence in both North and South Korea, and then talk about the Cold War, the United Nations, and the Chinese Civil War. That is because right around the end of today's episode, two dramatic buckets of water are tossed on American plans for the post-war international system that directly involve those three topics. And don't worry, I will let you know what those two buckets are by episode's end. To discuss all this correctly, I want to talk just a bit about the United Nations because it very much matters to the elections leading up to independence. However, we're going to leave our larger discussion of the UN until next week because the book I'll be basing a lot of it on did not arrive at my local public library in time for this episode. The United Nations was the second attempt by the victors of a world war to cement international peace through a massive diplomatic organization. The UN was discussed throughout World War II by both the major allies and smaller unaligned countries. Its structure and mechanisms of implementation were largely driven by the representatives of the United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and the Republic of China who were present at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference of 1944. That is why there are two main bodies in the United Nations: the Security Council and the General Assembly. There are 5 permanent members on the Security Council: the 4 allies present at Dumbarton Oaks, and France. Now, I'll get into China's inclusion on the Security Council next week, but it's important to remember for now that the internationally recognized China at the end of World War II was the Republic of China. Representatives of 50 potential UN members met in San Francisco in April 1945 and signed the Charter of the United Nations, which was then ratified by all 5 permanent members of the Security Council and a majority of other signatories. The United Nations went into effect on October 24, 1945. Fast forward 2 years, and we land upon American and Soviet military officers meeting in Seoul at the Second Joint Conference of the Joint Commission, as agreed to in the Moscow Agreement. Going into the conference, the Americans had already decided to take the matter of the future of the Korean Peninsula to the United Nations, but they had to show one more time that Soviet recalcitrance on the matter would not be broken down through negotiations and that they needed to invoke the authority of the UN. The plan was for the United States to ask the Soviet Union for a joint conference, for the joint conference to fail, for the US to ask the UN for elections observers, and then hold elections only in the South if the Soviets didn't want to play ball. This was all informal at this time, but it would become the framework for reality. To quote Bruce Cummings on the matter, by getting Korea policy deposited under the aegis of the United Nations, the State Department could reassert the virtues of internationalism without paying the costs. That is, gain an image of multilateralism and reasonableness without having to negotiate real trade-offs with Moscow, thus preserving the existing situation in Seoul. End quote. So the Second Joint Conference begins in May of 1947, and because both sides didn't really care to take things seriously, negotiations fell apart just like they did the year prior. The Soviets again refused to consult with any party that did not support the Moscow Agreement. The Americans proposed to only include the parties that did not support the Moscow Agreement. The tide goes out, the grass grows longer, the sky is blue. Negotiations finally collapsed on September 5th, and the Soviets left Seoul for good on October 22nd. One historical fun fact I found was that over the course of the conference, 425 Southern political parties registered with the Commission. Their total membership rosters altogether equaled 62 million people. That was about 400% of the actual population of Southern Korea at the time. Even then, the United States insisted on consulting each of them. Clearly, neither was going to budge from their position. This was all just a show. The last strokes of the commission came with a shock. In response to a letter from the U.S. Undersecretary of State Robert Lovett, the Soviets proposed that all foreign troops leave Korea immediately. This reflected a Soviet desire to draw back within their own borders and security responsibilities, while clearing the country that was rapidly becoming their greatest enemy out of a potential launching pad for invasion. Also, Korea was just not a major concern of Stalin. Eastern Europe was much more important, and for very good reasons that we will discuss next week. The United States, of course, would refuse because it had shifted to the idea of containment, which we will also discuss next week, and was dead set on taking things to the UN, which they did on October 17th, 1947. The man the Americans sent to the UN was one John Foster Dulles. This is before he would become the U.S. Secretary of State under President Dwight Eisenhower, but he already cut quite a figure through American foreign policy. A quick aside, his whole family is interesting actually. His brother Alan was the first civilian director of Central Intelligence for the United States, and his mother's father was John Foster, who helped to negotiate the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895 that we talked about all the way back in episode 1. John Foster also happened to graduate from Indiana University, just like me. So John Foster Dulles throws the doors open to the General Assembly, and everyone's head whips around to see who it is. That's definitely not how it happened, but I'd like to give Dulles some dramatic flair, even though I've seen him described as funereal and like an undertaker in most places. Never mind his lack of style. He succeeded in his mission, and on November 13th, the General Assembly approved the United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea. I said last week I would have a better name for this than the acronym, which is UNTCOK, and that name is the Grateful Eight. They're the Grateful Eight because 8 countries had delegates on the temporary commission: China, Canada, Australia, the Philippines, France, India, El Salvador, and Syria. All but Syria were either allies of the United States or received large amounts of aid from the US. But Grateful 7+1 just doesn't roll off the tongue like Grateful 8. Naturally, the Grateful Eight were decried by Kim Il-sung as running dogs of the Americans, which he was not entirely wrong. There's a reason they're grateful. The Grateful Eight arrived in Seoul just after New Year's, 1948, and set to work. From the jump, their purpose was clear: to provide a sheen of internationalist respectability to a new government of Southern Korea. There was little hope they could oversee any elections in the North, and there was no doubt the US had played the UN like a fiddle. Even if the Grateful Eight felt like they owed the Americans anything, they still had misgivings about their role in Korea. The National Election Committee, which was to certify candidates for the election, was dominated by conservatives, with 12 of the 15 original members being part of the Korean Democratic Party. To solve the problem, replacement committee members were simply listed as conservatives or rightists with no party affiliation. The Election Review Board, which was to make sure the elections were all above board, had 5 members. 3 were KDP members, and the other 2 were judicial appointees put in their roles in the first months of the occupation, back in 1945. As the Grateful Eight attempted to do their job without interference, the hodgepodge just kept interfering by accusing delegates of bias, censoring their mail, and sending observers to observe those sent to observe the elections. In spite of 3 of the 8 stating that they could not fulfill their mandate, elections were approved on February 26th and set for May. On the day of the elections, the Grateful Eight were carefully herded around the country to specific voting centers. Everything was stage managed, and even then they still did not like what they saw. That's how skewed this election was. Even the Potemkin version of it looked bad. In spite of that, the Grateful Eight were not faring well in Korea, finding the country not well suited to their tastes. In a bit of a huff, they declared the election free and fair and fine and went back home. South Korea had its new government. Syngman Rhee was voted into the office of the president by those delegates elected in May, and in August, the Republic of Korea entered stage right. Up north, the Soviets were decrying the American-rigged elections while holding their own rigged elections. Elections took place in August to fill the Supreme People's Assembly from a list of candidates approved by the Soviets, with 212 elected from the north and 360 from the south, which is just weird. I know that Southern Korea had 2/3 of the total population of the peninsula, so that makes sense, but I'm just a bit wowed at the lengths the Soviets went to in their drive to legitimize the DPRK's claim to sovereignty over all of Korea. On September 9th, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea entered stage left. Almost immediately, both Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung, along with their respective cabinets, went to work trying to convince their foreign benefactors to allow them to get on with it and try to boot each other off the peninsula. In the constituting documents of both Koreas, there are clauses stating that reunification of the peninsula under each respective government is the end goal. The DPRK's legal capital was even in Seoul, and that wasn't changed until the 1970s, despite the DPRK never having a presence in Seoul except for the few months they controlled it in 1950 and 1951. All the while, both sides consolidated power, with Rhee capturing the old occupation governance structure, which was the old colonial governance structure, and Kim utilizing his most ardent supporters in the guerrilla faction of North Korean leaders to extend control over the other factions and the People's Committees. In the South, the new government was thrown immediately into a fire. Back in April of 1948, a small rebellion flared and grew larger on Jeju Island, off the southern coast of the peninsula. This all came out of the fall of the Korean People's Republic and the conservatives' harnessing of the colonial governance structure to their own ends. People in Jeju were just fed up with it all. Bruce Cummings describes Jeju Island as a microcosm of what would later play out across the entire peninsula. What's ironic is that, because this was happening in 1948, by the time of the actual war in 1950, things in Jeju were calm. Not necessarily peaceful, but calm. A strong People's Committee had taken control in late 1945 and worked to maintain their control of the island through effectively administrating to solve people's problems. How awful. Police terrorism was used to beat back the moderately leftist residents that made up most of the island, and by April 1948, locals began attacking police stations to express their anger. The police reaction was brutal and was done in partnership with Americans stationed on the island. Small guerrilla bands sprouted up and were able to work their way through the old Japanese defensive positions and tunnels better than the police. The police, supported by the Americans, would continue campaigns of violence against the guerrillas, supported by their neighbors, throughout 1948. Only after one last campaign in March of 1949 would the Republic of Korea Army finally put down the uprising, killing, wounding, and torturing many on their path to success. The end of the uprising was finally declared in August of that same year. While all that is going on Jeju, in the southern port of Yoosu, 2 army regiments refused to embark for the island. This refusal turned into a rebellion as it spread across south-central Korea. And like those they were ordered to defeat in Jeju, the soldiers that would take part in the Yoosu rebellion were angry at the heavily biased and unrepresentative nature of their government. In October of 1948, one soldier recruited 6, who recruited another 40, who inspired many, many more. A new People's Committee was formed, and groups split off from the main mass of people to find landlords, police, or anyone dressed well to sacrifice at the altar of public anger. This was all spontaneous, and probably not directed by anyone north of the 38th parallel. That made it easier to contain and easier to put down, though, which the army did in a particularly brutal fashion. Torture, mass arrests, and random shootings were common by those sent in to end the rebellion. Within a week, Yoosu was quiet again. The importance of both the Jeju and Yoosu rebellions was not in their success, because they did not succeed. They showed North Korea that South Koreans were not a monolith following Rhee blindly, and they gave the Republic of Korea Army a grim morale boost heading into 1950. When, on January 17, 1949, now Ambassador Terentij Shtaikov told Kim Il-sung and Pak Han-yong, who was now the deputy premier of the DPRK, that they would be able to meet with Stalin, it seemed that the Korean communists' prayers had been answered. Now, they would be able to tell Stalin directly to his face just the sheer level of treachery the Southerners were inflicting upon the North. Before a date would be set, though, Shtaikov wanted them to write up their proposed agenda, and then Stalin would confirm the meeting. Importantly, he told them that military matters would not be on the table for this meeting. The Soviets wanted to continue to abide by the 1945 Agreement on Division and did not want to take any move that would even remotely look like they were trying to undermine the agreement. If the Soviets looked like they were undermining it in any way, then they would have no moral high ground against American intervention in peninsular affairs. So, on February 2nd, Kim, Pak, and Steikov set out for Moscow via a brief flight and a 10-day rail journey. They arrived on March 3rd, and 2 days later met with the big mustache himself, Joseph Stalin. Around the same time, President of the Republic of Korea Syngman Rhee was meeting with U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea, John Muccio, in Seoul. This was just another meeting wherein Rhee clamored for more weapons and supplies for the ROK Army and National Police, but this meeting had the addition of U.S. Secretary of the Army Kenneth Royal. After Muccio responded to Rhee's requests with refusal and a restatement of his continued desire for peaceful negotiations with the DPRK and the Soviets, Royal piped up and said in no uncertain terms that no military action against the North would take place as long as American combat troops were on the peninsula. He said that to even suggest such a thing was akin to requesting the removal of American troops from Korea. Rhee said, "Hey, that's not a bad idea. Leave me some more military advisors and weapons, and I think we could have a deal." Muccio and Royal left without, as far as I can tell, responding to Rhee's proposal. Throughout the first 3 months of 1949, border clashes increased in intensity and size. On January 15th, an ROK police unit crossed the border and attacked a local official's home. On the 18th, another ROK police unit attacked a small Korean Workers' Party office. On the 20th, a KPA guard outpost was attacked. On the 23rd, almost 100 ROKA soldiers tried to cross the 38th but were pushed back. On February 2nd, ROK police occupied a high point just north of the border, killed some northern guards, were pushed off the hill, and then returned with a full ROKA battalion to set up an observation point. These attacks were largely perpetrated by the Southerners, but that's mostly because the Northerners just didn't have enough men, enough weapons, or enough ammunition. On February 9th, a Soviet Air Force Major General attempted to commandeer an airfield outside Wonsan, on the east coast of the peninsula. Wada Haruki, author of The Korean War in International History, believes that this was an attempt by Stalin to force the Americans to halt their withdrawal plans and prevent a southern attack on the north. This is further supported by the reports coming out of the meetings between Stalin and Kim during Kim's time in Moscow in early March. Stalin reportedly gave Kim 3 reasons for not attacking the South at this time. The KPA was not a superior fighting force in every sector of the border, American troops in Korea would be able to intervene quickly, and the Soviets could not block American intervention if the DPRK violated the division agreement first. And yeah, Stalin was right on every count. The DPRK would have very much lost any war had they invaded at this time. There was also a real concern among Soviet leadership that an American withdrawal from the South would embolden Rhee to invade the DPRK, and that would be their opportunity to maintain the moral high ground internationally. There were multiple attempts to pretty much convince the Americans to stay in the ROK, from nearly basing more Soviet troops back in Korea after they had been removed in the last months of 1948, to taking the issue to MacArthur, who simply assured the Soviets that the remaining American presence in Korea was to train the officer corps of the ROKA. All that came out of this trip to Moscow was a 10-year agreement setting up the general rules of the Soviet-Korean relationship and a few other loan and aid agreements. Importantly, none had a specifically military component, although Kim did secure a 212 million ruble loan. I tried to figure out what that would be today in literally any other currency, but I couldn't find anything. It was a lot of money, but I just don't know how much of a lot it was. If you know, please let me know. I'm very interested to find out. In the middle of April, Steikov was directed by Moscow to investigate a report that the hodgepodge would soon withdraw from Korea, and that the ROK was already moving forces into place for an invasion shortly thereafter. This matches a report from U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall to Ambassador Muccio that imminent action by the South was expected within the next 60 days. It was true that American forces were close to withdrawing from Korea, and it was true that the ROK was positioning forces along the 38th parallel just north of Seoul, where the transportation routes were best developed for a quick trip to Pyongyang. These troops were itching for a fight, given that 24 border incidents occurred between March 15th and April 15th alone. The only thing that kept an invasion from happening was Muccio's continued assurances that American support would remain steady to the ROK, so long as they did not invade the North. The United States, at this time, really did not want to get involved in another war, which is smart when we're talking land wars in Asia. We'll discuss it more next week, but the military budget had shrunk a lot since 1945, forcing reductions in total manpower of all branches of the U.S. Armed Forces. A key area of Korea that would be an epicenter for border clashes was the Ongjin Peninsula, northwest of Seoul. It would remain a sore spot between North and South Korea up to the invasion of June 1950, because it was part of South Korea, but not actually connected to any other part of South Korea. Its connection to the main body of the peninsula was north of the 38th parallel and therefore North Korean territory. This made it difficult to defend by ROK troops and a tantalizing target for border incursions by DPRK soldiers. A fight that would begin in May continued until the end of June, with both sides attacking and counterattacking across the 38th parallel. This highlights a major problem with Rusk and Bonesteel's division plan. The 38th parallel follows no logical path across the Korean peninsula. There's mountains, there's rivers, there's villages, there's islands and smaller peninsulas. It's just an unnatural border and is difficult to follow in some areas. It really was a bad idea to draw such a nonsensical line between two hostile groups. I don't really blame Rusk or Bonesteel. They were in a tough spot. It just sucks all around. American troops largely left Korea by June 29, 1949. What remained was an advisory and training contingent of about 100, whose only goal was to train the officer corps of the ROK Army. At this time, South Korea had roughly 127,000 men under arms, and North Korea had roughly 102,000 men under arms. This balance would even out in July with the arrival of 2 Korean divisions of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Altogether, these 2 divisions added 28,000 trained and tested combat troops to the Korean People's Army. These troops would become the crack units of the KPA and bolster its forces to 5 full infantry divisions. Through August and September, both Kim and Ri would repeatedly push their respective international patrons to allow them to invade the other. So far, both Stalin and U.S. President Harry Truman, and those below them, held the line, and provided small amounts of material and financial aid to satiate Kim and Ri's thirst just enough to keep them from acting on their impulses. The small-scale attacks continued from each Korea, designed to pester each other and slowly push each other closer to the brink of war. 3 events towards the end of 1949 would really kick things up a notch. On August 29th, the Soviet Union would test its first nuclear weapon. On October 1st, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And on December 29th, just before the calendar would turn over to the fateful year of 1950, Truman would approve NSC 48/1, a report of the National Security Council cementing containment of the Soviet Union as the main foreign policy goal of the United States. What I've been trying to say this entire time, in way more words, is that both the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea actively tried to instigate the other into open war as soon as they became independent. Violence became the name of the game on the 38th parallel almost as soon as it became the border between 2 countries and not just a line separating occupations. Although the North Koreans would eventually invade the South en masse, the South's hands were not clean. Both sides wanted to reunify the peninsula, and it often seems that both sides wanted to use force to do so. Peaceful resolutions would not have been enough. In the grand arc of our story, we've gone from the tragedy of Korean anti-colonialism, to the original sin of division, to the mistakes of occupation, to a set of systems that defined themselves in large part against the other. This state of affairs was not just the fault of the Americans and the Soviets. Many Koreans were involved in making sure things played out as they did, and boy, were they ever excited to take things to the next level. Before we end today, I would be remiss to not mention the 67th anniversary of the signing of the Korean Armistice on July 27th. It was the culminating event of 2 long years of negotiations and 3 longer years of war. It was ultimately a compromise that left a people divided and 2 countries where there should be one. I hope you were able to commemorate the victims of the war on both sides, and I hope you continue on this journey with me until we reach that point. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now. as the two Koreas poke and prod each other towards open war. Next week, we're going to actually leave the Korean Peninsula and talk about two things: the beginnings of the Cold War and the beginning of the United Nations. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you're not on social media, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.